Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us for our first in a series of 6 winemaker panel discussions hosted by the Consortium of Franciacorta in the month of June as part of our first ever digital Franciacorta Festival. My name is May Matta-Aliah, and I am the Franciacorta ambassador here in New York. I will be moderating this discussion with all future discussions as well, so we hope that you will join us for those. And by way of a brief introduction for anyone who's joining us who may not be familiar with Franciacorta, in brief, it is a sparkling wine whereby the bubbles are created through a second fermentation that occurs within the bottle. And this results in a wine with very fine and elegantly textured bubbles. The region of Franciacorta is located in the northern part of Italy in the region of Lombardy, and it is hemmed on by the southern edge of Lake Iseo, which is the fourth largest lake in the Lombardy region. It's a rather small winemaking region. It just covers just over 7,000 acres of vineyard land. And the region is sort of shaped like an amphitheater. So the grapes grow within this somewhat protected amphitheater-shaped wine region with the moderating influence of the lake that is north of that wine growing region. So this is a very brief overview. Today, we'll be discussing the history of Franciacorta. And we'll be taking a step back to learn about the origins of the name, some of the steps that were created in the creation of this DOCG. And we are joined by 3 terrific producers from the region today, and I will be introducing them actually going from left to right on my screen. So the first person on the left of my screen is Christina Giliani. Christina and her brothers, thank you, Christina. Christina and her brothers, Paolo and Arturo, are the current owners of the Guido Berlucchi Winery, she is in charge of communication, marketing, and hospitality. Franco Giliani, who is Christina's father, is considered the father of Franciacorta. And this year, 2021, marks the 60th anniversary of the very first bottle of Franciacorta, which he created at the Berlucchi Winery. The Berlucchi 61 label is a fitting tribute to the winery's legacy. Next, we're joined by Roberta Bianchi from Villa Franciacorta. Roberta, together with her husband, Paolo Pizziol, are the owners of Villa Franciacorta Winery. From her father, Alessandro Bianchi, who sadly passed away in March 2020, Roberta inherited both her passion for wine as well as the historic winery cellars. Alessandro Bianchi was among the founding members of the Franciacorta Consortium, which was created in 1990. And last but not least, to the very right of my screen, we have Riccardo Ricci Corbastro from the Ricci Corbastro Winery. And Riccardo is an agronomist, a winemaker, and the owner of Ricci Corbastro Winery. Riccardo's father was among the 11 founders of the Franciacorta appellation in 1967. And Riccardo was the president of the Consortium Vini Franciacorta when they achieved their DOCG status in 1995. And since May 1998, he has been the president of the FEDERDOC, the National Confederation of Associations for the Protection of DOC Wines. Of note, the winery also has a fascinating agriculture and wine museum at the property, which is the result of more than 30 years of research. So should you ever have the opportunity to visit this wine region, and I hope that you do, you should visit all of those producers, but you should definitely make a stop at the museum, which is really fascinating. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Riccardo, for joining me. All such wonderful members of the Founding This Appellation. And we're going to start by posing my first question. I will pose it to Riccardo. And I will say that whenever I try to introduce people to Franciacorta, one of the first stumbling blocks I have is the name and the origins of the name. Can you explain to us a little bit about the origins of Franciacorta name? What is it in reference to?
Well, thanks. We have to go back 10 centuries ago when monks coming from Cluny settled down in our area. They probably brought in a couple of the grapes that we still use, that are Chardonnay and Pinot Bianco, and their monasteries were really powerful. So they were monks that were not responding to the local bishop, but also their goods, especially wine, were probably not paying any taxes, were moving from the countryside to the free city of Brescia that was at that time completely independent. So they were, in the Latin language of that time, free courts, in Latin Franciacorta. That's the origin of the name. By the way, the name Franciacorta appears for the first time on an official document in 1277, and it's an order given by the city of Brescia to two municipalities of Franciacorta, the villages of Rodengo and Gussago, to repair the bridge on the Mella River. Mella is the border, the east border of Franciacorta, facing the city of Brescia. And this order was given to these people, saying you have to repair it for you and for your friends of Franciacorta. That means that the use of the name was much more ancient, because they received an order and they were knowing perfectly who they were working for. That's the origin of the name.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned the first documented mention of the wines was when? In 12?
The first document talking about wines are probably a couple of books that, well, we have some informations during the Roman time and so on, but what is really concerning with our history are two books, both of the 16th century. The first was published in 1570 by a physician, Girolamo Conforti. He wrote Libellus de Vini Mordaci. Again, it was in Latin. That was the scientific language of that time. He was investigating how a wine that was very common, a wine that was a sparkling wine, was affecting the digestion. That was the interest of the doctor. Of course, he was doing that with an Aristotelian vision. That is not something that we are interested in today. But this document is very important because it's telling us that in that century, that means over 5 centuries ago, people was drinking a lot of sparkling wine produced in the region. The name of the sparkling at that time was Vino Mordace. In the same period, another person that it's an agronomist, Agostino Gallo, published his 20 Days of the Agriculture and the Life in the Villa. And in this book, he's also telling us how they were producing a sparkling wine that was, of course, not fermenting in a bottle. The bottle was not yet invented. It was invented 2 centuries later, but they were practically stopping the fermentation of the must at mid-fermentation by sinking the barrels into wells or into cisterns with cold water. In this way, the cold was stopping the fermentation, and then in spring, they were able to take the barrel out. The fermentation was starting again, and they were getting a wine with bubbles. That's the origin of the tradition in the region that was then rediscovered in 1967 with the appellation.
Wonderful. I love that. And now today we're also seeing some producers of sparkling wine putting wine underwater
Yes,
in bottles, but they're
bubbles.
Yeah. So
that time it was barrels that were more reinforced with more iron around in order to let them ferment also.
Wonderful. So there was a history of sparkling wine even back then, or intentionally trying to make sparkling wine even back then.
Yes,
Were they also making still wines as well in the region?
The region was also producing still wines, white and red, of course. And so the first appellation was mentioning the three, the sparkling. At that time, the appellation was only one, Franciacorta, and it was white, red, and sparkling.
Great. Thank you, Ricardo. This was wonderful. Now, Christina, over to you. We are celebrating the 60th anniversary of I suppose the release of the first sparkling Franciacorta that was envisioned by your father. So tell us a little bit about that. What was his inspiration to start making sparkling wine in Franciacorta?
Well, hi everybody, and let's say that we can say that the idea sparkled directly by this territory itself. But we must go back not too many centuries ago, but in this historical land, as Ricardo said, historical and wine producing land, we go back to 1955 when Guido Berlucchi, who was a noble, he belonged to a noble families like many others. For example, Riccardo is also from a noble family. Franciacorta area was an area where many people owned lands and have castles, and Guido Berlucchi was also one of them. So in 1955, he had the idea to, as many others, to bottle the grape, the wine produced by the grape around his castle, but in order to produce a white still wine. Actually, he didn't have such a expertise about producing wine because he wasn't really a winemaker, but and so he was looking for a consultant, and through a friend, through a common friend, he met my father, Franco Giliani, who was 10 years younger than him and who had just graduated from a enology school in Alba, Piedmont, and who had a big dream. His dream was to produce what he always considered his favorite wine. So he wanted to produce a sparkling wine, but only using the so-called, in that time, Champenoise method. And now we call it traditional method. So with a secondary fermentation into the bottle, because he believed that soil, this land, the soil, the climate, and probably the grape, as they didn't have the grape was really a mixture of varieties, but using Pinot Blanc, he thought that he could reach a good quality. So it took some years of failing attempts because there were no proper corks, you know, in order to keep the pressure inside the bottle, no proper glass bottles because again, they have to be special, no tools, no equipment, and the only thing was, you remember, Riccardo, the only thing was passion and a very determined, innovative idea to reach what it was his big dream. And so, fortunately, finally, in 1961, as you said, that I think it was also a great vintage. They had the opportunity to bottle the wine produced from that harvest. And the number of bottles they produced were only 3,000. But it was really a huge quantity for them because I think that they had never seen such a big quantity in their life before. And so they stocked them in the antique cellar under Guido Berlucchi's castle, and they wait until the next year to taste it because they had their finger crossed.
Mm. That's wonderful. I love that. And what was the wine called at the time? What was the wine name? Was it named Franciacorta at the time, or?
Yes, because they also had I'm in charge of marketing, and so yeah. I love to understand why people do things sometimes. And I think that the big idea was also not to use the private family-owned name that was Berlucchi, because Berlucchi owned the vineyards and my father was the consultant at the beginning, and then they made a company, but they used the name of the grape that they were supposing to use, Pinot Blanc, and the name of the region, so Franciacorta. So the name on the label was Pinot di Franciacorta. And that was the name that the producers that started the production also used for years. And that got the appellation in 1967. And that became, after years only, Franciacorta, dedicated to sparkling wine.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's wonderful. And that actually is a great segue for my next questions for Roberta, which is about the grape varieties that are used today. So you mentioned Pinot, it's called Pinot di Franciacorta. So what grape varieties are used today in the region of Franciacorta to produce sparkling wine?
Today we use 4 different varieties, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Herbamat. And Chardonnay has now been grown in Franciacorta several decades and currently covers 80% of the total area. The Pinot Blanc, the third most popular wine in Franciacorta, is of French origin and belongs to the large family of the Pinot, and now occupies about 5% of the total area. It's not used on its own, but in the cuvée up to maximum of 15%. Then Pinot Noir, the second most popular wine, occupies 15% of the total area and is mainly used for vintages and Riserva varieties of Franciacorta DOCG, to which contribute to create structure and longevity to the wine. And it is also a necessary component for rosé. At least 35% of the rosé must be composed of this grape.
Okay,
and the last one, but not the last, is Herbamat. Starting from the 1st of August in 2017, Herbamat was included in the Franciacorta and Franciacorta Rosé in an optional measure of up to 10%. It's used to mitigate the effects of climate change thanks to its high level of acidity. So these are the grapes that we are using today.
Wonderful, thank you. So yeah, Herbamat was recently introduced, right, in 2017, I think it was, the Herbamat, yeah. So Chardonnay plays a very important role in the vineyards. It's 80%.
Yeah.
Of the vineyard today. Was it always recognized as a grape variety, or because I thought that there was a predominance of Pinot Bianco in the region?
Oh, yes. Probably Chardonnay and Pinot Bianco arrived 10 centuries ago by monks from the Cluny, but we know that farmers spoke about golden Pinot and green Pinot, so we can say that there is an old familiarity with two kinds of grapes. Pinot Noir instead arrives in 1967 with the Franciacorta appellation. So about Chardonnay and Pinot White, my father used to say that in the 60s there was no difference between Chardonnay and Pinot White, but only in the 1976, 78, Chardonnay was recognized as a different varieties from Pinot Blanc, sorry.
Interesting. Okay, so up until the late 70s, Pinot Bianco and Chardonnay were not really considered two separate grapes.
Yeah. The epigraphy not included two different varieties, but all people think that the two varieties was the same.
Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you. That's really interesting. So let's go back. I know we mentioned this a little bit, but you know, it's always kind of interesting to remember that really the Franciacorta today, it's a fairly young region, maybe. But I mean, we think of it sometimes as being young. But what year was Franciacorta granted its DOC? I know the first wine was released in '61, but when was the DOC granted, Ricardo? That question is for you.
21st July 1967, so something more than 50 years ago.
And a day that's not memorable for you at all, apparently.
No, but at least we have a fixed point in a long story. And I would say that our production specification, what we call the disciplinare, that it's for the Italian and European system, a law. But it's a very strange law because it's not written by a parliament, it's written by the producers. And we have been changing our specifications over 10 times since 1967,
Wow.
because Franciacorta has always been improving its attitude to produce quality. And if we talk about Franciacorta today, even if it is a very small region, and even if we produce not a huge amount of bottles, it's because of the quality that our bottles are showing. So the first law specifications was in 1967. Then, as Roberta already mentioned, in 1984, we had to change the specification, clarifying that the Franciacorta was produced with Pinot Bianco and Chardonnay, because in 1967, we were only talking about Pinot Bianco and Pinot Nero, because at that time, Chardonnay was just a clone of the Pinot Bianco. Then another important step for us was 1993, when we decided that the Franciacorta could be only bottle fermented. Up to that moment, it was also possible to produce Franciacorta with fermentation in beds, but since just two producers were doing that in the 90s, but from that moment, in 1993, Franciacorta became only bottle fermented. And again, we changed a little bit also the rules of the rosé, introducing the rule that it should have a minimum of Pinot Noir. That again, something that was not so common at that time. Finally, in 1995, you already mentioned it, we got the DOCG. And in that moment, we also splitted our appellation. Up to that moment, Franciacorta was white, red, and sparkling. Since 1995, we have Franciacorta DOCG. The word sparkling has been banned, so we cannot use the word spumante, that is the Italian for sparkling. We just call it Franciacorta. And then we created a second appellation that is Curta Franca DOC for the still wines, white and red. Curta Franca is simply the Latin name of the region. So it means, again, the same thing, but sounds different. And this was a very important moment, because for the consumers, for the market, it was much more easier to understand. I want a Franciacorta, means you want a bubbly wine or a wine with bubbles, long aging, and so on and so on. And on the other side, you can ask for a white or a red, asking for a Curta Franca. In 2008, we had another important moment when we introduced the Satin in our rules, in our specification. Satin is one of the typologies of the Franciacorta that can be Franciacorta, Franciacorta Rosé, or Franciacorta Satin. The name Satin is coming from silk, so it's a very velvet and round, rich wine, rich Franciacorta that it's a great combination with the with food. Fish.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, Ricardo, just to say that we are also doing a seminar on Satin, and we're doing one on Rosé coming up in the next few weeks.
I just introduced this. Well, then we have been changing the rules again in 2010, 2017. A new one is ready to be published. I think in a few months we will get the new edition of our specification.
So a lot of changes happening all the time,
Yes,
right? And
every day. We
we
always think about how to improve ourselves.
Wonderful. So I'm going to throw this back to Roberta and ask you now, I know a lot of these initiatives are actually happening by the producers, but also we know, for a region to sort of move in one direction, you need a leader, and you have a very dynamic consortium in the region. Yeah. So when was the Consortium in Franciacorta established?
Yes, on the 5th of March 1990, the voluntary consortium, the protection of Franciacorta, was founded. And 1 year later, in March 1991, the Franciacorta technical rules were approved. Okay. So Villa Franciacorta, one of the oldest cellars in Franciacorta, thanks to my father, Alessandro Bianchi, is one of the 29 consortium founding wineries. And there is many wineries, 29, that contributed to founding this consortium.
And how, so 29 were part of the founding members in 1990. How many wineries are today? Do you know?
I think
how many members?
It's correct.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Riccardo, I think. Yeah.
So your father, Villa Franciacorta, was one of the first wineries. What were some others that were around back then?
If you want, I can read, because 29 is not possible to remember all of them.
Yeah. No, of course, we don't have time for all of them. Just
okay, Ricci Furbastro is here, so it's not possible to mention it. And Monte Rossa, the first president, Bersi Serlini, Lo Sparviere, Maiolini, Castelveder, Barboglio, Cadembosco, Bella Vista, Mosnel, Uberti, there is many and many. So
wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. No, it's really nice to have people who are so influential in the establishment of the of this appellation, the DOCG, to actually be joining us today to talk about the history. And then my final question is back to you, Christina. Today, when we, and Ricardo sort of mentioned this a little bit, but when we say today Franciacorta, we are talking about the sparkling wines, but you do also make some still wines in the region. And can you just remind me what the wines, the still wines of the region are presented as? Are they called, they're not called Franciacorta?
Yes, because we decided to use Franciacorta name only exclusively for sparkling wine. And only, as Ricardo mentioned, only by secondary fermentation, so bottle fermentation, traditional method. So we cannot, when we ask for a bottle of bubbles produced here, we say, give me a bottle of Franciacorta. So we don't talk about sparkling wine from Franciacorta. But, and this was also an important decision in order to give a big and strong identity to the principal production of this territory, because we still kept some smaller production of still wine, either red and white, about, if I'm not wrong, around 800 acres. Of vineyard dedicated to still wine, with same varieties for the white sparkling, so Chardonnay, Pinot White, and Pinot Blanc and Pinot Noir, and other varieties for the red still wine. And we decided to have one name for the still wine. So it's a fantasy name, but the sound go back to Franciacorta, and the name is Curte Franca. That is the antique name of the region. And so we have these two appellations that give a precise, of course it's difficult because it takes time to educate people in order to understand that Franciacorta is a specific category. You know, in Italy, everybody talk about Prosecco, but not only in Italy, everywhere. So what our effort is, apart from being very strictly to the quality, is also to make people understand that the method, the terroir, and the people living here is focused on that category. And we hope that our children and nephews, future generation, will have this small area also famous all over the world, as we are trying to do now all together.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. We are almost going to run out of time, so we did want to open it up to some questions and answers. I know that we might have some questions in our chat. I know that we were getting some questions on Facebook. So Constance is going to throw some questions at our panelists. And Constance, take it away.
So we have just a few, but the first is, besides Pinot Noir, which grapes are or were historically allowed in the Corte Franca? Anyone feel free to answer. Maybe Christina or Ricardo? Sure.
I think the most, actually, I don't know, because I think probably, but I asked Ricardo because he is much more precise. He is our rules and numbers man in the consortium. I think it was another red wine, probably, not specific Pinot Noir. I don't know, Riccardo.
I think the question was, which are the grapes we are using in the still wines? Is that correct?
No.
Oh.
Which was, before having Pinot Noir, what was the red wine used for rosé?
I don't know, because probably no one was producing rosé before. We know
Well,
that
actually,
we know if we go back to the book of 5 centuries ago, we know that they were producing a rosé because they talk about short keeping it on skins in order to extract the color before the fermentation. But we don't know which were the grapes, so we don't have something to compare. What we know in terms of red grapes in our area is that we have the Carmener, what today is called the Carmener, that was the Roman Vitis Biturica, that was brought in 2000 years ago by the Roman soldiers. And Carmener is the father of Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. So we might imagine that some of the caps were there, but we cannot say it for sure.
Well, another question on grapes for Riccardo. Someone says, I have heard of the historic grape that is now allowed in the blend. It's called Herbamat. Can you tell us a little bit about its history?
Well, again, we find information about this grape in Agostino Gallo book, so 5 centuries ago. We know that it's a grape that has a high acidity, so it was showing a long ripening season. It was mostly forgotten because of the high acidity. Now with the general climate change, we decided to study it again. So 15 years ago, the Consortium has been studying the grape. We've been starting vinifying a little bit of these grapes. And finally, we decided it was an interesting grape for the Franciacorta blend. So since 3 vintages now, it has been reintroduced in our specifications, so we can use this grape again. So as part of our history, was forgotten because of the general climate changing of that time. After the 16th century, the temperature fall down for what we call the small glaciation. Now that we are going into a very hot season, it's interesting again.
Maybe because at that time people were looking for very sugary wines with much alcohol than acidity, because wine was used for personal, instead of steaks. So instead of meat, it was energy product. So people needed to have very strong wines.
We have one follow-up question actually on the Herbamat. Why is it limited to just 10% today?
Because when you change a tradition, when you do something new, you must be you must go slowly. So we decided to try it up to 10% in order to see if it's really the answer we were looking for. And maybe in the future, we might decide to increase the percentage. But actually, it's better to understand how it works. And we all have only 2-3 vintages of experience, not enough in the winemaking world.
I just add something about, for example, we have only 2 hectares dedicated to Herbamat, and we haven't put any percentage in any cuvée, but we prepared some bottles of Franciacorta only made by Herbamat, because we want to test how it's going, and before saying that its quality is suitable for Franciacorta quality.
Actually, we have a question from Switzerland now. Why is there a limited amount of Demisec produced in the region?
Because we want Franciacorta to be drunk with this fantastic food we have in Italy. So this is my opinion, but I let all the people answer about, because I think this is a personal idea that each single winery can have, you know, each single producer can, it's, you know, your own winemaking philosophy. Demisec is for, it's a product with a, that is perfect to be paired with dessert. But Franciacorta idea instead is to have a very complex and high acidity and structured wine. It's not a sparkling wine. It's a wine that happens to have bubbles. That's the difference.
If I can answer, we in Villa Franciacorta, we produce a Demisec. As Christina told, is correct. It's some of the philosophy that seller decided to have. We think that it's important to have a complete offer of the different varieties of sparkling wine. And the Demisec help us to have a product for not also for the dessert, but it's very interesting to pair it with cheese, marinated cheese, to have a contrast between the sweetness and salts. And it's very important to have also acidity and structure. So you can have a Demisec that is not also sugar, but because the sugar inside, as you know, is more than the other typology, but with the good acidity is able to clean the mouth and to have a good pairing with cheese. So it could be something different that complete all the range of your Franciacorta.
I'm also a producer of Demisec, by the way, and I think that another problem for Demisec is that people cannot easily understand what Demisec means. It's a little bit like for you Americans when we say that rye is sweeter than brut, and then you say, how is it possible? Unfortunately, it's a scale and you have to learn it, and no discussion about it works. The same is for Demisec. Probably another name could be easier also for the consumers to approach this kind of wines. Anyway, it's a niche.
All right, we have actually another question on the Corta Franca. Why must the rosso be a blend? Any?
Why, master?
Why was what?
Why must the Corta Franca Rosso be a blend?
Traditionally, it was a blend. Again, there are two philosophies in the world. On one side, in Europe, we mostly have wines that are coming from blends. And if we look at the American attitude or the American market and what the producers have been doing in order to achieve a better knowledge of what was in the bottle, they started producing wines that were made with one grape, or at least a blend of a couple of ones. That was easier to understand and also to recognize. For us, it's different because the wine has been originated by the local history. And so it was part of the daily meal. It was perfectly matching with the local food. And you know how rich is Italy about different traditions. So when you discuss about Italian wine, you must understand that it's a long history behind it. And blend was probably showing something that is more equilibrated compared to a single varietal wine.
Makes sense. Christina, is your father still involved in the winery today?
Yes, fortunately. Ricardo is laughing. He's 90 years old in a few days, on the 21st of June. Unfortunately, of course, he's not so powerful like he was until last year, actually. He is still involved. He is the president of the company because, as I said, after some years of partnership, then my father bought the majority of the company, but he's so powerful that a few years ago, he said, okay, guys, he said to me and my brothers, I think this is the end of my working life, so I'm going to sell the company, and we were shocked because we said, oh my God, after 30 years of, you know, passion and working here, we were a little bit, you know, the idea is to go on with generation. And he said, okay, if you want, you can buy it. Okay, and that we did. So we bought the company, and so now we are the owner, but I mean, he is already he's there. And I think at the beginning it was really shocking, but now I'm happy because I understood the reason why he did it. Because if you have a present, you don't understand the value. If you have to pay what you are going to do, probably you give more value to what you have. So
Can I explain why I was laughing?
Yeah.
I know quite well your father, and I know that it's always difficult for a son or a daughter to talk about his father. So what I can say, he's a great man. And as all the great personalities, he's a strong personality. So even not living the life of the Giliani family, I'm sure he's still there.
Yes, you're right. Thank you.
Then we just have one more general question for Roberta. Why is it important for the region to have a consortium?
Sorry?
Why is it important for Franciacorta to have a consortium?
Oh, it's very important for the protection of Franciacorta, to have the control, to have also for consumer, I think it's very important to know that the consortium control everything. So to have these technical rules help us, and also I think the new generation that start to create new sellers to have a guideline of what we think is important to do Franciacorta, because the name is important, represent a land, a wine, and it's important that the producer are able to respect the rules, and the people are sure that the rules are respected, and to have a guarantee of the good product that is good, not also for the degustation, but also for health, because we are very we pay many attention for the to respect the nature and the product.
Great. Well, I think that's it for the questions. So
thank you, Constance, and thank you, Christina. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Ricardo, for making the time to join us today. I know that I always find it fascinating to listen to you and the history of this region, and I'm sure that our guests did as well. Everybody who joined us on Facebook or on Zoom, thank you for joining us. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention that we will be, this is, as I mentioned, the first on a series of 6 webinars that we're hosting on various topics about Franciacorta. So the next one will be on Monday. They will be on Mondays and Wednesdays at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And the next one will be on Monday, June 14. We will delve into the fascinating discussion of the various biodiversity initiatives that Franciacorta has been embracing. They've done a very interesting study. There's been a lot of discussion right now about biodiversity sustainability. And sometimes it can just become a bit too much of a marketing hook, but in this region of Franciacorta, it's actually amazing what they've been doing, and I think you should want to tune in and listen. And our panelists will be Mr. Silvano Brescianini from the Barone Pizzini Winery, Laura Gatti from Perghettina, and Francesca Moretti from Bella Vista. So